Okay, so now for my talk. I apologize as well because in my haste today, I completely forgot to print out my notes. So I'm going to be doing this from my phone, which means it's slightly more difficult. The first thing I want to do, though, is thank you to everybody who's organized this trip for me, who's made all of this possible. It's been an amazing organizational effort, and I really appreciate everybody's work on it. Now today I want to open with a very simple but essential question for my talk. How will we spend our time in the future? If we look to some of the leading thinkers in the past, they believed that we would spend our time in leisure, pursuing our own interests and furthering the development of humanity. So thinkers such as Karl Marx, William Morris, Bertrand Russell, and many, many others all saw the expansion of free time as a core part of a future society. John Maynard Keynes, for instance, famously wrote in 1930 that if economic development continued, that in 100 years we would only have to work 15 hours per week. We still have a little time to meet that. Now the rest of the time would be to ourselves. The contrast with how we think about work today and the future of work today couldn't be starker. In recent years, this optimistic vision of the future has disappeared and been usurped by a fear of automation. Many have forecast that there will be an inevitable wave of automation based around new developments in machine learning and robotics, and it's set to swamp the labor market and dramatically reduce the number of jobs available for humans. So rather than a future where everyone's basic needs are met and we're free to spend a growing proportion of our time doing what we want, now the worry is that AI and robots will throw workers into the unemployment line where a growing population struggles to make ends meet. Politicians and economists have responded to this threat by arguing that we need to retrain workers for the digital age. This has typically meant a new focus on getting people educated in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, but also business management programs and learning how to program and code. My first key argument of today, though, is that undercurrent trends, our most likely future involves spending our time caring, not coding. The evidence suggests that the future of work is increasingly oriented around the labor of social reproduction. This is the work of cooking, cleaning, caring, all of the activities that go into reproducing society. And in fact, many countries already spend a vast amount of time doing this work. If we look at paid labor, social reproduction is a major source of jobs in many economies today. The NHS, for instance, is among the biggest employers in the world. And this graph here shows that these jobs have been taking up an increasing proportion of the economy from about the 1970s onwards. If social reproduction was considered its own sector, it would be recognized as the dominant source of jobs in the wealthy countries. To give a comparison, at its peak, American manufacturing employed around 30% of the labor force. Social reproduction is set to soon surpass that figure. So if we once spoke of manufacturing powerhouses, we now need to speak of social reproduction in the same terms. Crucially, these numbers only look set to grow in the future. Looking at the US government's projections for job growth, one journalist recently noted that 9 of the 12 fastest growing fields are different ways of saying nurse. In the UK, government forecasts are that 47% of new jobs are set to be in social reproduction. So everywhere we look, social reproduction is becoming the main sector of the waged economy. This becomes even more significant when we start to include all the unwaged work done towards social reproduction. By the calculations that I've done, along with Helen Hester, unwaged work, most of which is social reproduction work, takes up around 50% of our total working time in any given society. Put simply, reproductive labor of some kind, whether waged or unwaged, increasingly takes up most of our collective working lives. A large part of this has to do with this chart here, the changing demographics of the world. In most regions of the world, populations are getting older on average. Fertility is also decreasing, which means there are fewer younger people. People are living longer, and this means that the working age population has peaked in many countries, and there's a growing proportion of elderly and young people becoming dependent on them. This chart here is for the world, but the next one shows what is projected for Argentina as well. Another reason why social reproduction is becoming so prominent is that it's difficult to automate in general. Care work tends to require significant social skills and empathy, and tasks like cleaning a house, for instance, involve complex dexterity that's beyond the reach of robots so far. They can do assembly line work quite easily, but cleaning up your clothes is incredibly difficult. So this work is notoriously immune to productivity increases, in the same way that manufacturing might be subject to these increases. If we return then to my initial question, how will we spend our time in the future? We have a first answer. We'll spend a large portion of our future time, both paid and unpaid, doing reproductive work. There are a number of problems that arise from this future, though. First, this work is typically unpaid, or if it is paid, it's paid very low wages. Second, the demand for this work is outpacing the supply. We have more care needs than what we can actually provide for. Third, this work is distributed in highly unequal ways, across genders most notably, but also across classes. And fourth, this work is often mentally and emotionally exhausting. So we may end up spending our future doing work that is difficult, exhausting, low paid, and where the burden largely falls on women. Can we imagine a different way to spend our future time, though? So in my work with Helen Hester, we've asked, can we address the secular changes which are bringing about the rise in social reproduction, while also retaining the hopes of those post-work thinkers? Combining these two ideas, post-work thinking and social reproduction, turns out to be more difficult than we might imagine. And in fact, when we look at the history of this work in the home, it turns out to be stubbornly resistant to any sort of reduction in time spent. We can take domestic technologies as a first instance. And in post-work visions, technology plays a very large role because it promises to facilitate an increase in living standards at the same time as reducing the amount of work required. And in the early 20th century, the home underwent a radical change as it became industrialized. Homes became connected, sewers, water lines, electricity, gas, and new devices emerged to take advantage of these novel domestic flows. Washers and dryers, dishwashers, vacuums, fridges, freezers, and so on. This was a period when the home saw all sorts of new labor-saving technologies introduced. In the 1970s, a number of researchers, most notably Ruth Schwartz-Cohen, started to look at the amount of time that housewives were performing in the home compared to the pre-industrial times. It would seem obvious that with all these new technological devices, we would have reduced the amount of work that's being done in the home. And yet, when researchers looked at the data, they found that wasn't the case. A housewife of the 1970s was working just as much as a housewife in the 1900s. All that new domestic technology had barely made a dent in the amount of domestic work performed. Things haven't gotten much better since then. Even to this day, various studies find that there have been changes in the type of work which is done in the home. So we do less cooking, for instance, and there's changes in who does this work. The sort of massive inequality in genders is slowly diminishing. But when we look at the average person, we still do around 25 hours of domestic work, roughly the same as what we did a century ago. Domestic technology, therefore, has not fulfilled its promise of freedom. And the big question is, well, why is this the case? The first reason has to do with expectations. For Cohen, Ruth Schwartz-Cohen, she looked at how scientific discourses around hygiene spurred on a whole slew of new work to be done. And they also intermingled with class-based ideas and racially biased ideas of cleanliness as well. So new devices might have made cleaning the home easier, but social expectations around how clean your house was supposed to be also rose alongside them. The result was that people used the new technologies to keep things cleaner rather than to get more free time. In the words of one historian, laundry went from being a weekly nightmare to an unending task. And I have 3 children, and it is an unending task for me. It's not just about cleaning, though, as social norms exist around every aspect of reproductive labor. From ideas about how to raise children, social expectations about looking after the elderly, norms around cooking and eating and so on, there's all these different expectations around the work of social reproduction. And all of them are shaped in turn by different cultures, scientific discourses, advertiser budgets, and much more. So there's a major story to be told here about the history of these norms and how they've changed over time. In the decades since Cohen, for instance, some expectations have decreased. Cooking, for instance, has generally seen fewer expectations in recent decades. And there's more acceptance of things like takeaways and microwave meals and stuff like that. It's led to a steady decrease in the amount of time that people are spending on cooking in the home. Households are also generally spending less time cleaning, although this is in part due to wealthier homes hiring cleaners to do that sort of work. By contrast, though, the time that we spend on childcare in many countries has massively increased. The emergence of so-called intensive parenting means that we now spend more time on our children than when we lived in the age of stay-at-home mothers. Competition over jobs and university places is what's driving this intensification. Parents want their children to have a good life, which they believe means getting a good job. A good job requires a good education, and which requires treating your kid as a piece of human capital to be trained from birth onwards. So it's these sorts of social norms which help explain how and why the vacuum of free time has been taken up by, well, vacuuming. Another key reason, though, why technology hasn't reduced domestic labor has to do with the social unit that's devoted to providing it. And this is particularly the nuclear family. There's considerable diversity in terms of how people actually organize their domestic lives, but the nuclear family continues to be widely celebrated in many countries as a cultural ideal, and it's also actively reinforced by a series of state policies. Yet in terms of reproductive work, the family is wildly inefficient and a vast repository of gendered inequalities. Women, of course, remain responsible for the bulk of unwaged social reproduction, even as their hours in the waged workplace are brought increasingly in line with women's. In Argentina, for instance, women are spending around 5 hours a day doing unpaid domestic work, while men do around 3 hours a day. This is according to time use studies from 2021. There are also, though, qualitative differences to consider when it comes to work within the family. Studies of childcare, for instance, show that fathers tend to spend their time doing the comparatively enjoyable work of talk-based educational and recreational activities with children. Mothers, instead, tend to do the more mundane and routine physical and logistical caregiving tasks. So even the types of work which are being done in the family can be quite unequal, even if the hours aren't. More than just the inequalities of time, though, the nuclear family is a highly inefficient way to provide reproductive labor. As Cohen notes, nuclear families in and of themselves invite a massive duplication of effort. So she writes, out there in the land of household work, there are small industrial plants which sit idle for the better part of every working day. There are expensive pieces of highly mechanized equipment which only get used once or twice a month. There are consumption units which weekly trundle out to the markets to buy 8 ounces of this non-perishable product and 12 ounces of this one. There are much better ways, much more efficient ways that we could be organizing reproductive work. The other key thing to note about the family is that without any meaningful alternative to it, the family becomes the carer of last resort. We could see this very clearly during the coronavirus pandemic. The state simply assumed that the family would pick up all this work, all this childcare work, as schools shut down, as nurseries shut down, and all this work got pushed back onto the family. More broadly, though, the family has always been positioned as the carer of last resort. In an emergency, women are expected to cut back their hours in employment to step into caring roles. So to tend to an ailing parent, to look after chronically ill family members, or to look after and raise a very young child. It's always women stepping out of the workforce to go and do that work in the home. And in fact, the neoliberal project has long held up the family as a key institution, going against its focus on the market, but also it notes that it requires the family precisely for its role as a shock absorber, as a sort of unit which can pick up this reproductive work. The end result of all of this is that the family becomes consolidated as a necessity. Where else would people get care from? But there's also an intensification of work placed on the family as more and more work is expected of this social unit. For all of these reasons, the reliance on the family to provide reproductive labor means that there are hard limits to reducing the amount of work that society devotes to it. Now, the last reason I want to look at for why domestic technologies haven't haven't given us more free time has to do with the spaces of the home. Now, as many have noted, the rise of home ownership has been crucial to contemporary capitalism because of its role in things like speculative finance, property development, and more recently, what's been called asset-based welfare. In no small part, housing, for instance, is a core foundation of economies like America's. But home ownership is also important under capitalism for another reason. And I think it was beautifully summed up by a 1940s property magnate in the United States called William Levitt, who said that no man who owns his own house and lot can be communist. He has too much to do. Owning one's own house, particularly the single-family home so dominant in America and spread elsewhere, meant a significant expansion of work that you have to do. There's the maintenance of the house, there's keeping your lawns kept up, there's working to pay off your mortgage, and so on. In other words, housing has been used to perpetuate a particular configuration of values around hard work, busyness, individualism, self-reliance, and family structure. This model of the housing was actively exported by the US during the Cold War. This is perhaps most famously in the so-called kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev, where the US model was presented as a much better alternative to the Soviet model of the kitchen. But these ideas were also exported via the housing support that the US offered allies during the bipolar period. And the focus of this international aid given to countries like Taiwan, for instance, was often to support home ownership policies and to foster the building of individualized homes. The result has been the reinforcement of a certain domestic imaginary. This is what Helen Hester has called domestic realism, the phenomenon whereby the isolated dwelling and the privatization of household labor becomes so accepted and commonplace that it's almost impossible to imagine life being organized through any other way. That this should be the case, despite many people's lived experiences of the pressures and difficulties of unpaid domestic work, makes such an attitude, I think, all the more remarkable. So, what is the alternative then? I want to set out three broad ideas for what we can do to imagine a different future. These are organized around three principles: communal care, public luxury, and temporal sovereignty. The first principle is communal care, which is a response to some of the problems commonly associated with the family as it stands today. So I argued the family is a system of privatized care, which is massively overburdened by the demands placed upon it. It cannot and should not be the sole linchpin for managing so many of our caring needs within society. So we instead need to foster the transformation and expansion of caring relations. And this is what communal care invokes. Now, there are two key aspects to this idea. The first is to to reduce the pressures that compel people to live or stay in nuclear family households. This particularly means challenging state policies that currently privilege the family at the expense of other ways of living. So policies around child custody, power of attorney, social security, carers allowances, all these sorts of things, they're all oriented towards maintaining the family. Government policies, in other words, should be adjusted to better accommodate non-nuclear living arrangements and to ensure that such arrangements are not unfairly penalized. The second aspect of communal care, though, is that we also have to build the alternative institutions required so that new approaches to care can flourish. Take childcare, for example. In the kind of society that we're envisioning, much greater support for communal childcare would be available, in particular in the form of high-quality, 24-hour universal childcare, which was a prominent demand of the 1970s feminist movements, but seems to have been forgotten since. There are some recent models, though, that we can learn from. We could look to Portugal, for example, which is currently rolling out free universal early years care, or we could turn to Denmark, where government support for childcare has been steadily increasing in recent years. They offer high-quality daycare, which is guaranteed for people, highly subsidized by the state, and for the poorest, access is simply free. Staff in Denmark are mostly professionalized and decently paid, while a large portion of government-financed care is in fact organized by the voluntary nonprofit sector. None of these examples are perfect, they have their own problems, but they nonetheless point to what it might mean to communalize this one aspect of care. The second principle I want to talk about is public luxury, which is particularly significant in terms of urban spaces. Now, luxury is typically conceived of as a positional good, a pure status object that aims at establishing a hierarchy between the few people that can have an object and the rest that can't. And if that's our idea of luxury, public luxury seems like a contradiction in terms. However, we can contrast this idea of luxury as a status object with a different version of luxury. This idea of luxury is about high quality, regardless of the quantity of supply available. And this is luxury that is about things which go beyond mere need. After all, as a leader of the industrial workers of the world once famously noted, nothing is too good for the working class. Public luxury aims at providing the infrastructure needed for social reproduction and the maximization and enjoyment of free time. But it's infrastructure that goes, again, beyond just mere basics. The idea extends to wonderful parks and playgrounds, public sports centers and swimming pools, galleries, allotments, and public transportation networks. Public provision, particularly in countries like the UK and the US, is often seen as a last resort, something which only poor people take up. Public luxury demands more. We can draw inspiration from a number of different places as well. Helsinki's lavish Udi Library, Moscow's famous metro stations, stylish public housing in Brussels, and also America's luxury public pools, which were largely closed after the 1950s. And an example which I just learned about yesterday, which is quite relevant to here, which is the social tourism initiative, which I have to say, I Googled about this, trying to find an image of it, and there's almost nothing in English about this. It's a fantastic initiative, and the rest of the world needs to know about it, I think. So if anybody wants to translate material on it to English, you should go for it. There's all sorts of other examples I could draw upon as well to give you an illustration of public luxury, but looking at one example in particular might help here. What would public luxury look like in the realm of cooking and eating? As a first stage, we might imagine universal free school meals and breakfast clubs being provided for primary and secondary schools. Finland, for example, has had a free school meal program in place since the 1940s, with children from pre-kindergarten up to the end of secondary school all provided with a healthy meal for free. The United Nations has also recently set out universal school meals as an important part of the right to food. Such steps would be significant for time saving, I can't tell you how much time I've had saved by the free school meals for my children. But it's also incredibly important for responding to childhood food poverty. And in line with public luxury, these meals could offer far more nutritious approaches than what the children might otherwise get. Beyond this, we might also imagine communal kitchens. There we go. There are numerous examples around the world of communities working together to ensure that everyone is fed and the burden of cooking is shared. But one of the more intriguing inspirations, I think, comes from Britain's public canteens during World War II. This time period in British history is mostly thought of as one of food rations and household scarcity. But the war was also a period when some of Britain's poorest ate better than what they typically ate beforehand. This is because, in response to the problems of feeding the population during wartime, the British government established and subsidized a program of public kitchens designed to provide healthy and nutritious meals. These were originally called communal kitchens. Churchill then decided that sounded too communist. He renamed them British restaurants afterwards. Some of these canteens had table service, others were organized more like a cafeteria, and many had services via which people could order food to go. There was even mobile versions of it which could reach rural areas. At their peak, these kitchens were producing around 4 million meals every week for the population. Remarkably, some of them also had their walls decorated with works of art taken from Buckingham Palace and the National Galleries, which I think is perhaps as good an example of public luxury as you can get, moving it from those private spaces, bringing it out into the public. Cooking is currently wildly inefficient and wasteful of food, of energy, and of time, but there are plenty of interesting alternatives that we might learn from. And now my final principle before I conclude, temporal sovereignty. All of this brings me back to my initial question: how will we spend our time in the future? And the principle of temporal sovereignty says that we should maximize our free time, the time within which we are freely able to deliberate and choose what to do with our lives. As the philosopher Martin Hagelin writes quite beautifully, if it were given what we should do, what we should say, and whom we should love, in short, if it were given what we should do with our time, we would not be free. Under capitalism, we are given the answer to the question of what we should do. We are told what to do. Capitalism forecloses in advance the question of freedom for so many people for so much of our time. Fundamentally, the vast majority of us have to accept giving up 40 hours or more per week in order to survive, typically selecting from a very narrow range of possible jobs where decisions over what we do on a daily basis are completely outside of our hands. And even our free time under capitalism is warped by the insistence on having productive hobbies and perpetually making oneself more employable. In a future organized around the minimization of necessary labor, the situation would be vastly different. We would be faced with the immense question of our own desires. As Keynes argued, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real, his permanent problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. For him, this was nothing less than an existential issue for humanity. But temporal sovereignty is not just about an individual form of freedom, a freedom from society. It's also about the freedom to create our own norms and obligations with other people. This means having to coordinate socially amongst ourselves and creating the rules that we freely take up. It also means having to deliberate and negotiate between competing values. So if capitalism closes down the competition between values, it's only after capitalism that we actually have that free choice. To give an example of these competing values, we can easily imagine a situation where you're setting up childcare in a post-capitalist world, and on one hand, a large public institution supplying childcare might be able to minimize work as much as possible by mobilizing efficiencies of scale. But such an institution might also conflict with values around democracy, accountability, and flexibility. So a future society might instead choose to build more localized, cooperative forms of childcare, even if they meant more work had to be done by society. And I think such trade-offs would exist throughout a world organized around free time. In order to foster deliberation and negotiate between values, the principle of temporal sovereignty demands that we build new democratic methods and institutions. We need to imagine a massive expansion of democratic opportunities for people to have a voice in the norms and rules that are governing their lives. Ultimately, what matters is not so much the endless reduction of labor per se, but instead the cultivation of time and institutions through which we might consciously and collectively guide the development of humanity. The goal of minimizing necessary labor in order to expand the realm of freedom is simply a condition for being able to ask these questions in a meaningful way. Or, to conclude, we need the freedom to determine the necessary. Thank you very much.
Bueno, entonces arrancamos. Muchas gracias, Nick, por tu conferencia. Muy interesante y muy recomendable el último libro, escrito a 4 manos. Entonces voy a empezar justamente la primera pregunta por la promesa incumplida de la tecnología, que no solamente no cumplió con su promesa de darnos más tiempo libre, sino que tampoco, según la investigación, nos hizo más productivos. Entonces, mi primera pregunta es... ¿Estamos bien? Bien. Mi primera pregunta es, entonces, si este es un tema de la tecnología en sí mismo o es un tema de que esta tecnología ha sido producida y construida justamente en el marco del capitalismo de plataformas, que es otro de tus grandes aportes, ¿no?, en la discusión.
Yeah, so I think the question of technological development is a really interesting one. I think it's one of the biggest problems for capitalism at the moment. Despite the seeming rapid advances of technology, the key indicators of things like productivity growth have been slowing down for decades now, which indicates that technology is not developing as much as it once did, particularly back in the Industrial Revolution. And this is a general trend across the economy, but it also, I think, has a particular application within the home, that the sort of domestic technologies that we've received just aren't addressed to the needs of people working in the home. You know, the only major new technology we've had in the home since the 1950s is the microwave. We've had the computer as well, of course, but the computer is not so much a labor-saving device in the same way that the washer and dryer is and the vacuum is and things like that. So there's been a complete dearth of new domestic technologies. I think part of the problem has to do with that general lack of technological change, but also a very specific lack of focus on investment in that area. So one of the really interesting things we found in researching this book was that if you look to communities, particularly sort of isolated communities, whether they be isolated for religious reasons or political reasons or whatever, but situations where women are given a lot of control over technological development in the community, they are extremely imaginative of all these new domestic technologies that are useful in the home, that save them time. So there's a real, I think, a gap here between who is developing these technologies, who are they being developed for, and I think, you know, we could quite easily imagine a situation where the means of technological development were much more widespread and given to people to try and imagine these new technologies.
Sí, justamente en relación con esto, en el libro son muy prolíficos en hacer esta historia de la innovación para el hogar, que es muy interesante cuando uno se pone a pensar. Es verdad, hoy sería genial con un prompt decirle a tu cuarto que se ordene en vez de generar un contenido. ¿Por qué no? Ahí estamos. Entonces yo me preguntaba, y en relación con lo que me contestabas antes de la innovación tecnológica para el hogar particularmente, ¿por qué ninguna de las propuestas de ustedes son tecnologías, ¿no? Porque digo, hay un problema en la generación de tecnologías específicas para generar mayor tiempo libre y para alivianarnos a todos. Las hipótesis que ustedes mencionan son varias, como recién decías, digamos, esos sesgos en la producción de la tecnología, pero también bueno, el tema de cuánto cuestan los trabajadores, especialmente las trabajadoras asalariadas que trabajan, ¿no?, en el hogar, que es una de las cosas que también, una de las hipótesis que exploran. Pero bueno, me preguntaba eso de por qué ninguna de las propuestas para mejorar el tiempo libre es una propuesta tecnológica.
The focus on technology, I think, is overdone in post-work at times. And also because when we look at the history of these domestic technologies, the real problems have to do with the social relations, not the technologies themselves. So we could quite easily imagine the invention of the washer, the washing machine and everything, dramatically reducing the amount of work that people had to do. But it didn't because of the social relations. You know, there's an alternative history where instead of individualized washers and dryers, we all had communal laundries. And this was very popular for a while in the 1920s and 1930s. But we didn't go down those sort of paths. So part of the reason why we don't focus on technologies is precisely because those social relations, I think, are more crucial. The other reason why is because we're not designers of technologies. But we do think that we can sort of set out some of the conditions to enable people who are designers to be able to do this stuff. There's an absolutely brilliant book from the 1970s from a design theorist. I think a couple of design theorists called How Things Don't Work, if I'm remembering it correctly. But it talks about how all the technologies we have are highly individualized and simply not designed for collective living. So for instance, if you wanted to share around a tool that you might have in your home to your neighborhood community, it's probably going to get broken at some point because it's not built for that sort of thing. So they go through a whole series of different technologies and show what it would be like to properly develop communal technologies, technologies which could be shared. So that sort of thing it's beyond our expertise, but there are, I think, you know, the sort of that design history that we can learn from.
Sí, recomiendo mucho el libro porque también habla de esta idea de que, como decía recién en la presentación, subieron los estándares y las exigencias, no solamente para ser más limpios y más higiénicos, también para ser mejores padres, comer comida más sana, ¿no? Todas esas cosas que a algunos les resonarán están muy bien tomadas en el libro. Con respecto a cuando mostrabas estos casos de estos ejemplos de diseños urbanos más proclives o más amigables al tiempo libre, que aparecen como, bueno, quizás excepciones, ¿no? Me preguntaba si te parece que hoy nuestras ciudades que están diseñadas alrededor del trabajo, poniendo el trabajo como centro, podrían ser imaginadas de otro modo, pero de una manera integral, digo, más allá de ejemplos puntuales. ¿Crees que eso puede pasar?
I think it absolutely can. I think cities like Barcelona are quite interesting in that regard. There's a real focus on making cities walkable, making all the crucial amenities accessible to people, localized, reducing dependence on cars, you know, all these sorts of things which can be done right now. You know, they're not always easy to do, but they can be done right now. I think another key thing which the pandemic showed was communal green spaces. You know, if I had to keep my children locked in my house for that entire period, we all would have gone crazy, you know. Having those communal green spaces available was crucially important for getting my children to get fresh air, to be able to play, to be able to do all these things which they weren't able to do in nursery and school and things like that. So yeah, local green spaces, but then also, you know, I've really noticed the difference between types of green spaces and the quality of them. You know, some are just plain nothing there. Others are much more elaborate. You know, mine, I'm fortunate, has a playground and a cafe right there. It's beautiful. But I've also read a story about one which had a laundrette combined with the playground. And the idea being that women could bring their laundry and their children at the same time, get the laundry done while the children are playing, and combining, again, all these sort of reproductive tasks in one place. So these are the sorts of things which, you know, have existed, and we can imagine similar sorts of alternatives for the future.
La pandemia y las restricciones asociadas a la pandemia cambiaron en términos generales lo que la gente cree de los espacios públicos? ¿Te parece que hay como una revalorización general? Digo, en tu caso sí, pero ¿vos ves que hay un cambio a partir de la pandemia en la consideración de los espacios públicos y del funcionamiento de la ciudad?
There's definitely a much bigger emphasis on precisely those green spaces. One of the problems we've really had in London is the privatization of a lot of these spaces. So massively closed down, becoming inaccessible, starting to charge a fee to be able to access various things. So I think that's starting to change in London. People are recognizing a lot more the value of these available spaces. I will say as well, one thing which I think is quite unique to the UK, and I don't have many good things to say about the aristocracy, but they did create some beautiful parks and they're now available to the public, and so I appreciate that.
Justamente quería preguntarte en relación a las tareas de cuidado en particular. Hay una línea teórica y metodológica que lo que busca es cuantificar todas las tareas de cuidado que se hacen y empezar a discutir en esos términos, ¿sí? Cuestiones como la equidad, la productividad, eventualmente los retiros, etcétera. Y otra línea que no es necesariamente excluyente de la anterior, que busca que el mundo del trabajo se impregne y acepte y reconozca que las personas cuidan en algún momento de su vida o en todo momento de su vida a niños, a adultos mayores, a personas con necesidades, etcétera. ¿Cuál te parece de esas líneas quizás la más potente políticamente de cara a una discusión que transforme la realidad?
I think, in political terms, probably, so I don't see them as competing, first of all. I think the effort to quantify this stuff is a way of making it visible and legible. But I think that quantification is particularly important politically because this is what politicians look at. It's what economists look at. They want to know what is the impact on GDP. And we know the problems with GDP as a measure, but it still is such a powerful indicator of everything else in the economy. So I think, the efforts to quantify this stuff are really important in terms of being able to say, here is what the value of this stuff is to the economy. Here's how many, billions of pounds are being saved by having people do this work for free. Here's how many billions of hours are being done every single year by people doing this work. So I think that is really, really important. The flip side of that is that sort of pure quantification aspect misses the qualitative aspects of that work. And for most people, that work is pretty shitty. The work is, it's exhausting, it's tiring. If you're doing it at the home, you're not getting paid. If you're doing it in the labor market, you're paid very meager wages. And in most countries, if you're a domestic worker, you have very few rights. And in fact, in many countries, the legal system is set up so that domestic workers are, in fact, excluded from a lot of existing labor rights. So it's a terrible job, and I think we have to make visible the quality of these jobs, as well as the sheer quantity of time and money that's being spent on this work as well.
En Capitalismo de Plataformas vos investigaste justamente, trazaste una historia que fue pavimentando el estadio actual del capitalismo, cuyo último hito era la crisis de 2008, digamos, una corriente hacia la austeridad, hacia el desarrollo de infraestructura y hacia la caída en los derechos laborales, etc. Me pregunto si el actual desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial, del machine learning, digamos, este nuevo estadio del capitalismo de plataformas representa un hito distinto, un salto, algo que te parece que es particular en esta historia.
For one sort of key reason, it's that AI as a general purpose technology is applicable across the economy. And this is quite different than, for instance, having a social media platform where you control the social media industry. With AI, it's more like you control a basic means of the entire economy. AI can be used everywhere. So if you control that sector, you control a lot of different elements of the economy. And I think all of the sort of AI companies today are doing this in different ways. A company like OpenAI, for instance, is trying to develop the most advanced AI that will just be able to do everything with one single model. And then you look at a company like Google, which is also doing that, but also trying to build all of these very specific AI models for specific industries. So Google has an AI model for education, they have an AI model for healthcare, they have an AI model for chemistry, for math, for all of these different areas. And I think that effectively what's happening here is that there's an expansion of control by these companies. Political control, so if you control this basic means of the economy, you then have control over all these other companies that are dependent upon you. But it's also a means of economic control in terms of the sort of rents that can potentially be extracted from it. If generative AI and AI more broadly becomes essential to businesses, they're then dependent on Google and OpenAI and Microsoft to provide this stuff, and they can charge quite a pretty penny to get those services. So I think it's a real expansion of power across industries in a way that wasn't quite there in platform capitalism. And that for me is quite concerning. These companies already have huge amounts of power, and it seems to me like it's only growing now.
¿Crees que se está desarrollando un contrapoder a este tipo de a este nuevo estadio o a esta nueva realidad del, no sé cómo llamarlo, si es capitalismo post-plataformas o capitalismo de la inteligencia artificial?
Yeah, a counterpower is difficult because it's so expensive to do AI. I mean, these companies are spending $100 billion a year to just build new data centers. And if you listen to them, they say, well, we need $1 billion to do a single run, or 10 billion, or 100 billion to do it, a single model. The amounts being spent are huge, and it's hard to imagine who else can do that except for basically 3 companies in the world. Nobody else can really do it. Even governments can't do it. They can't afford that much money. So the idea of a counterpowers, I think, is quite difficult to imagine, like building an alternative. There is, I think, still viable efforts to control the uses of these models. And I think it's really important as well that we're not just focused on things like deepfakes and election manipulation, as important as all of that stuff might be. We also need to look at the antitrust, the monopoly implications of all of this stuff. Because if these companies are gaining power across industries, we need to be thinking about, well, how do we prevent that now, rather than once they've already gained a foothold and become essential technologies for healthcare, for finance, and I think really worryingly for the military. A lot of these companies are now turning to getting military funding from the Department of Defense, from the Pentagon, from Israel, all of these situations. So that to me is where we need to focus a lot of our attention in trying to prevent that from happening.
Los estados, sobre todo los organismos que nuclean varios estados, están poniendo el tema en agenda de un modo apropiado o acorde a estas inquietudes?
I think most of the focus so far has been on the bad uses of AI. So trying to prevent these companies from using AI in negative ways. There's not been as much focus on the companies actually holding this power and accumulating the power. With a few exceptions, the FTC in America, for instance, has said some stuff about the power that's accruing to these big AI companies, but there's not been anything concrete that's emerged from it. Similarly with the UK, there's been a few words about it, but nothing that's really concretely come out of it. One thing that'll be interesting to look at is a lot of countries are looking at the relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI, between Amazon and Adept, between Google and, what was the company? Google and Character. So all of these really close relationships where basically big tech is controlling some of the leading startups. And it'll be interesting to see how countries respond to this, because it is, I think, clearly an attempt to grab power, and whether or not countries will agree is yet to be seen.
Volviendo a los temas de la presentación, pero también en relación con esto, hablabas de formas de cuidado comunal o de espacios públicos de lujo, digamos, que puedan mostrar que lo público puede tener una mejor calidad que lo privado o algo que sea aspiracional. Y por supuesto nosotros tenemos la situación de que pareciera que una gran cantidad de gente votó y eligió un camino o un tipo de discurso que justamente habla de la libertad desde un sentido muy individual, ¿no? de la posibilidad de tomar decisiones para uno mismo y en contra incluso del colectivismo, como es algo que se escucha o se empezó a escuchar. ¿Te parece que se puede recuperar en la conversación pública una idea de lo público por afuera? O que va a tener, digamos, porque esto que pasó en Argentina pasó obviamente y pasa en otros lugares también, o sea, como que parece haber una fuerza de mucha gente buscando un camino más individual, pero estas propuestas que van hacia lo común, ¿te parece que pueden recuperar peso y lugar en la conversación pública y en la política?
I think they can. I think one thing to note about Milei, but also about Trump and about numerous other governments, is that oftentimes voters are voting for them not out of necessarily a belief in their ideas, but out of exhaustion, impatience with the traditional parties. It's happened in the UK, it's happened here, I think, it's happened in the US. There's a real exhaustion with all of these traditional approaches, precisely because they don't have answers, I think, to the problems that we face in contemporary society. So that's the first key thing, that a vote for Milei or Trump is not necessarily a vote for all of their ideas. Secondly, though, I think the left needs to argue for freedom in a much more substantial way. I think the left, for far too long, has given up on the idea of freedom and left it to neoliberalism as a sort of key idea for them. But the neoliberal idea of freedom is so minimal, so lean, so there's nothing there. It's great freedom if you have massive amounts of wealth. Otherwise, again, you spend most of your time being told by somebody else what to do. You spend most of your life considering how do you make ends meet. There's not a lot of freedom there. And then you go to the supermarket and you might be able to choose between a few different products. This is a really weak idea of freedom. You have no actual deliberative choice over what you're doing with your life, over how you are spending your time. And I think the left can offer a much better idea of what freedom is, a much more substantive idea of freedom. And I really think that the left should make that a battleground for the future, pointing out the limits of freedom as it exists now and arguing for a much more vigorous idea of freedom, which to me requires free time. I mean, I don't understand how you can have freedom without free time. It's definitional aspect. So that means fighting for a shorter working week. It means fighting for more holidays. It means fighting for more long weekends and things like that. It means fighting for a shorter working day. It means fighting for all these various ways in which we can get more free time. And that just means instantly more freedom for people. So I think the left can build a narrative around this, and every country will have a different way of doing this. In the UK, there's a story to be told about Thatcherism and Blairism and the collapse of that in 2008 and the decimation of any ideas since then. Here it's different. In the US, it's different. But freedom, I think, is absolutely crucial to build into any left vision of the future.
Estaba pensando recién mientras hablabas de libertad, cruzar, digamos, el tiempo libre y capitalismo de plataformas, porque uno de los usos del tiempo hoy y la defensa es la idea del on demand o de esta posibilidad de un consumo individual de plataformas, de feeds, de contenidos personalizados, como que hay también un cruce ahí en las nuevas generaciones. Me gustaría saber si te parece que esa idea de libertad tiene que también dar cuenta hoy de que ese tipo de consumo o ese tipo de capitalismo de plataformas hoy es parte identitaria, ¿no? de las nuevas generaciones.
It's not just a sort of natural desire to spend all of your day on a smartphone, for instance. Companies make their money by you staring at your smartphone, by you being addicted to their services, to their platforms. And so, of course, they've built in all sorts of behavioral ways in which you're stuck within their platforms and you pay attention to their platforms. I had to delete TikTok off my phone because it was just too addictive. But these systems are designed that way. The other thing, though, is the flip side of it. Children today don't have alternatives in many cases. You know, when I was a youth, I would go to the mall and I would hang out with my friends in the mall. And in many cases, that's been decimated. So what do kids do now? Well, they hang out in social media. They hang out through video games. And these are replacements in some sense, but they're fairly poor replacements, I think, for, you know, hanging out in a park, hanging out in a shopping mall, being able to have that sort of lived community. So I think, you know, it's these two aspects, that drive to capture attention by companies, but also the decimation of public spaces, which naturally leads people into these very individualized echo chambers.
¿Crees que eso sería así, el espacio público como un antídoto?
I think they facilitate it. I'm not going to say they'll be the solution to everything, but in many, many cases, I think, well, particularly young children, I know my children, they hate being stuck in the house. They want to go out and play. They want to go out and play with their friends. And I'm sure it's the case when they're teenagers that they'll have the same sort of inclinations. And it's partly a matter of, is the space there for them to be able to go and do things? Are there recreation centers? Are there sports fields for them to play on and things like that? So yeah, it is a matter of providing them with that infrastructure to play, to have fun, to be free.
Después de estas preguntas, Nick va a estar firmando libros, así que los que lo tengan.
¿Qué tal, Nick? ¿Cómo va? Yo lo que te quería preguntar viene más por el lado de la generación del empleo y si ves, digamos, a las nuevas formas que surgen de empleo como un estadio realmente nuevo del capitalismo o como en algún punto una profundización de las tendencias que ya se iniciaron en los 70, mediadas por capacidades tecnológicas novedosas. Creo que esa pregunta puede echar un poco de luz a la discusión en términos de regulación.
The traditional narrative about economic development is that you move from agriculture to manufacturing to services. And I've always hated the category of services because it includes so many different things. It includes, the banker, manipulating people out of money. And it includes the domestic care worker in the same category. I think a much more interesting story about the trajectory of capitalist development could be told if we separate out social reproduction. And then we can start to see the emergence of a social reproduction economy, precisely, I think, because of these demographic changes and because of, William Baumol's idea of the cost disease. So there is this shift from the productive sectors, employment being pushed out of there by increases in productivity, towards these sectors that are less productive. And that, to me, is increasingly narrowly focused on social reproduction. So yeah, I think I wouldn't say it's a universal trajectory of capitalism, but I think quite clearly there's been a number of major economies which have moved from manufacturing to, let's say, financial services, and now are moving towards social reproduction as a key economic sector.
En la propuesta se parte de la premisa de que la tecnología redujo el tiempo de trabajo, ¿no?, de mercancías, y cómo hacer para que el tiempo de trabajo de cuidado, de reproducción social, se reduzca de alguna manera, ¿no?, socialmente. Ahora, no todas las personas están ubicadas en la estructura social de modo de poder, tener los beneficios de esa reducción del tiempo de trabajo productivo, digamos, ¿no? Entonces, con respecto a esto, te pregunto si en tu propuesta existen, porque no leí todo, existen articulaciones, por ejemplo, o qué pensás de la renta básica en Argentina, el ingreso ciudadano, como una política. Y lo segundo, si existen también entre tus propuestas vínculos, articulaciones con propuestas del ecologismo, la transición energética, que tienen en cuenta los límites planetarios para la producción. Gracias.
Yeah, great question. On ecology, we don't talk about it in the book, but my fundamental belief is that any sort of ecological approach to the future requires also thinking about reducing work. One of the key ways in which we produce carbon is through all of these work activities and, running factories and running offices and all this sort of stuff. And I think there's a real one of the tensions within the climate movement is people arguing for degrowth and sort of the slowdown of the economy. And then on the other hand, you've got the labor movement saying, well, no, but we need jobs. We need people to be working. There's a real tension there in many, many cases. And I think if the labor movement starts to think about more free time instead of more jobs for everybody, more work for everybody, suddenly the labor movement, the traditional labor movement and the climate movement can be much more compatible. On the other question about distinction between income levels, social classes, things like that, I think is absolutely essential. I think what we see right now in the world is a massive inequality of free time amongst classes. The wealthy can pay people to do all of this reproductive labor. You can have a cleaner come in, you can have a nanny come in, you can even, if you're extremely wealthy, I read about one woman who had a chef come in and make meals every single day. There's all of that work can be done by others if you're extremely wealthy, and you can have all that free time. The thing is, who picks up that work is the poorer people, the working classes. So on the one hand, you've got lots of free time, and you've got all that work being pushed down the social scale. So fundamentally, the project of free time has to be universal. Otherwise, it's simply another project of hierarchy and power. It's not always easy to be able to, overcome these divisions. I think a universal basic income is one way to do that. I find a lot of virtue in the idea of a universal basic income, and I think if we could get a decent one, I would be fully in support of it. My one hesitation about the universal basic income is that it requires a massive social force to get a decent one in place. To be able to get it passed and put into place. Not only to put it in place, though, but also to maintain it over time. And particularly in a country with high inflation, you can imagine the value of a universal basic income. Let's say you had one before Millet came in, what would he do? He would just let nominal value of it not increase at all, and the real value of it would massively decrease within a year. So there goes your universal basic income. Unless you have a massive social force, unions, labor movements, everyday people supporting it throughout all of that time. So I love the idea. I think the political elements of it are very difficult, though.
Yo soy Delfina y me preguntaba por cómo puede ser que hablamos del trabajo del cuidado y de una manera como si fuera irreemplazable. ¿Cómo puede ser que sea tan infravalorado, tanto dentro de la unidad doméstica como en instituciones públicas o privadas o a nivel global, pensando más en economías de América Latina que tienen, economías populares muy grandes? Y cómo puede ser que se mantenga este valor por debajo de lo que tiene que ser y cómo podemos hacer para cambiar estos valores.
It's because three different systems of power rely upon it being invisible. Capitalism relies upon it being invisible because it's free labor, free work that gets done and provides for capitalists. Politicians require it to be invisible because they don't want to have to pay for it. If you want to make a politician uncomfortable, ask them how they're going to pay for elder care in the future. Incredibly expensive to do. Much cheaper if you just have the family do it very quietly in the background. The patriarchy also relies upon it. This is a fundamental form of hierarchy, and it's a fundamental way in which patriarchy is reasserted time and time again, is that division of labor within the home. So as long as it's made invisible, that hierarchical structure can remain in place. So I think that's why it continues to be invisible, is you have these three very powerful forces whose survival in many ways depends upon it being invisible.
Hace un poquito más de una década escribiste Acelera junto con Williams, un manifiesto aceleracionista. Las cosas han evolucionado en una dirección y hoy, si se quiere, lo que se conoce como aceleracionismo ha tomado un curso completamente distinto. Al mismo tiempo, ahora tenés este planteo interesante que el futuro del trabajo no es la codificación, es el trabajo de cuidado. Y al mismo tiempo ya parece no estar el foco como tenías en capitalismo de plataforma, en esta dirección de tomemos las plataformas, sino en organicemos esto de una manera distinta. Y al mismo tiempo, en Acelera planteabas esta disputa con, si se quiere, algunos movimientos de izquierda que trabajaban más horizontalmente, comunitariamente, etc. Y ahora parece haber más una inclinación en la dirección política que propones en esa dirección. ¿Hay alguna especie de balance que hayas hecho?
It's always nice, yeah, to have these sort of long, overarching questions about like all of my different pieces of work. I think there's a fundamental compatibility between it all. I think the accelerationist work was about pushing beyond capitalism, using technology to do so, and thinking about the political means which are necessary to be able to do that. And fundamentally, it was also about liberation from wage labor. It was about free time. And that continued through Inventing the Future. It continues, obviously, in After Work as well. Platform capitalism, in many ways, was written as it answered the question for me of what are the challenges of implementing the ideas in Inventing the Future. And one of the biggest challenges was simply thinking about who are the major powerful actors in the world today, and that's big tech. So it was a question of, well, what is big tech doing? How do they operate? How do they gain their power? And that's what platform capitalism was fundamentally trying to answer, to gain an analysis of where their power comes from and how it operates. I think in terms of solutions, there's also a sort of continuity as well. I think I still have a preference for more large-scale solutions, let's say. They can be state-oriented or not, but much more of a preference for the large scale over the local. That being said, I think there's a lot of value in the local material as well, insofar as it's connected up with these larger networks of resistance, larger networks of, say, care providing, and as long as it's hooked up with, the labor movement and things like that. The issue we had with local movements in, say, Inventing the Future was precisely something like Occupy Wall Street, which thought that it could sort of transform the world by getting everybody to meet in a public square and just discussing these ideas, and in many cases actively rejecting institutional connections with unions and labor movements and political parties and things like that. I don't see that happening as much anymore, and I think in many cases people learned the lessons of the Occupy movement, and they learned what didn't work at that point in time. And so I don't think those problems exist as much anymore, but yeah, I see it, yeah, sort of fundamental continuity between my early work and the later stuff.
Bueno, con esta pregunta cerramos. Le agradecemos muchísimo a Nick y a todos ustedes por estar acá. Un aplauso. Bye.